The story behind the headlines. Every Sunday evening at this time, the National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the American Historical Association, presents Caesar Searchinger in his analysis of the news. In this analysis, Mr. Searchinger draws upon research material especially prepared for these broadcasts by eminent historians. Caesar Searchinger.
Good evening, everybody. The so-called Peace Conference of Paris has almost finished its work. During the last few days, it has approved the draft treaties for Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, leaving only Finland to be settled. And Finland is the least controversial of the five. In any case, the conference is bound to adjourn on Tuesday so that the statesmen can arrive in New York in time for the opening of the United Nations Assembly on October 23rd. It is in New York that the Council of Foreign Ministers may be able to finish their work on the treaties, for it is they, the Big Four, who have the final say, unless, of course, one of them prevents agreement by using the veto power. Now, that is why the Paris Conference can rank as a peace conference even less than Versailles, which concluded World War I. Even though Versailles, too, was dominated by a Big Four, the final decisions were recorded in plenary sessions of all the victor nations. This time, the final decisions, if any, will be taken in the Council of Foreign Ministers, charged at Potsdam with the task of drawing up the terms of peace with the minor and satellite enemies. The terms for Germany and Austria, you'll remember, were left for the still indeterminate future. The Paris Conference, under the Potsdam Agreement, has only advisory powers, and its advice can be taken or not. However, there are, by definition, two classes of advice. There are recommendations adopted by a simple majority and recommendations adopted by two-thirds or better. This was an ingenious compromise thought up by the British, who fondly hoped that the two-thirds decisions would have a more binding force. However, it was clear throughout the conference that all the voting on controversial points on which the Big Four couldn't agree, was on a cut-and-dried West versus East basis, usually 15-6 in our favor. On that basis, a great many so-called agreements were reached, which may or may not stand up in the Council. The idea was that the moral force of a two-thirds majority would so impress the Russians as to push them over the line. However, Mr. Molotov has indicated that they are not impressed by majority votes, certainly not by a kind of automatic division in which all the Western democracies vote with us, and what Molotov calls the developing Slavic democracies vote with the Soviet Union. If that is the case, the conference is very much where it was when it began its work 11 weeks ago. Nevertheless, a tremendous amount of work has been accomplished, and real agreement reached on the majority of the treaty provisions. As Mr. Molotov remarked, whenever the Big Four had agreed in advance, the smaller countries readily approved. Whenever the Big Four did not agree, there was a terrific tussle, ending in the usual East-West split. Thus, he argued, we should strive for more Big Four unanimity in order to build a more democratic peace. But it might also be argued that Big Four agreement, having behind it the power of the great victors, is something the small nations found it unwise or futile to argue with. What you get that way may be a realistic peace, but not necessarily a democratic one. The Italian treaty draft was the first to be completed, and it was voted on article by article till the small hours of the morning. The main controversial points are, of course, the future of the former Italian colonies and the boundary with Yugoslavia. The question of the colonies has been postponed by agreement of the Big Four for a year. As the boundary with Yugoslavia, the conference recommended 15-6, the so-called French line dividing Istria and Venezia Giulia. This compromise line pleases nobody, but it is the only one on which the majority, except the Yugoslavs, will agree. By the same majority, the conference approved the decision to internationalize Trieste. But there was a terrific battle over the statute by which the city is to be governed. The statute places supreme authority in the UN Security Council, which must appoint a governor. This governor will have the power, in case of trouble, to declare martial law and call in outside forces. This, we say, is the minimum requirement to ensure the independence of Trieste. The Slavs say it does not assure democratic government, but domination by the Anglo-American powers. However, they did insist on proportional representation in the elections for the local legislature, which presumably will have some powers. The Yugoslavs are livid with rage because they expected to annex Trieste, and probably still hope to. They threatened that they wouldn't sign the treaty. But our nimble senators countered that one in a typically Washingtonian manner. They added a provision that nations which fail to sign will be excluded from all the benefits of the treaties. Mr. Molotov, as a final warning, served notice that he could not accept the statute as it stands and might insist on reconsidering the boundary, too. There are fewer points of disagreement in the Romanian treaty, insofar as it concerns Romanian territory, boundaries, and reparations. But the two great sticking points, Danube navigation and commercial rights, are points which apply to all the southeastern satellite states. We, that is, the Western nations, insisted on inserting a clause restoring freedom of navigation on the Danube to all the interested nations, including the United States and Britain, for Russian military might has closed the Danube to all outside trade. The Russians maintain that Danube regulation is exclusively the business of the countries which it waters and should be settled on national lines. They profess to consider our incursion into this business economic imperialism. However, we are only asking for the continuation of old established privileges. Today, the business of international waterways has become a cardinal point in British and American policy, and President Truman emphasized this in an important pronouncement over a year ago. Now, last May, after it became clear the Russians would not reopen the Danube to international navigation, United States forces in Germany seized all the Danube shipping within our reach, 372 craft of various kinds. We are still holding them and have been roundly denounced for thus taking the law into our hands. Now, the Danube is easily the most important river in Europe. It flows along or through 8 countries and is navigable in all the 8. If and when the German-built Rhine-Main-Danube Canal is completed, it will, Russia willing, be possible to send boats and barges all the way across Europe from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Before the war, the Danube was subject to an international statute set up under the Treaty of Versailles. An international commission controlling navigation above Brăila in Romania, and a much older European commission controlled the Danube Delta. Senator Vandenberg, in his final speech extolling the freedom of navigation, pointed out that this European Commission dates back to 1856 and the Paris Conference of that day. Mr. Molotov didn't exactly appreciate being reminded of this bit of history. No wonder.
For that Paris Treaty of 1856 sealed Russia's most ignominious modern defeat
in the Crimean War. The great powers, France and Britain, at that time made her give up control of the Danube Delta and to cede southern Bessarabia to Turkey. What is more, Russia had to pledge herself to keep no fleet in the Black Sea and build no fortifications on its shores. As I said, an ignominious defeat. Out of that came the European Commission, which controlled the Danube Delta. Since its primary purpose was to keep Russian military power out of the Balkans, this precedent was hardly the most tactful for the senator to bring up. The upper reaches of the Danube in those days were controlled chiefly by Austria-Hungary. Not till after the First World War, was the Danube really internationalized under a commission possessing diplomatic rights and flying its own flag. All the riparian states, plus Britain, France, and Italy, were represented. Not so Russia, for Russia had again lost Bessarabia, this time to Romania, and was therefore not a Danubian power. Today she is, and all the other Danubian states are either wholly or partly controlled by her. Remembering past history, is it likely that Russia will now share her control of the river with her Western allies, including a powerful newcomer in this region, namely the United States? The Slav delegates made it clear on Friday that they would not yield on this point, despite the two-thirds recommendation of the conference. Prospect for multilateral trade in the Balkans are dim. The other point in the Balkan treaties is equal trading rights. We believe in equality of opportunity for foreign interests in these countries, and therefore we have written into the treaties a proviso for most favored nation treatment for a period of 18 months, enough to get our foot back in the door. The Russians are determined that we shan't. Molotov says that to impose equality of opportunity on these weak little nations would lead to economic imperialism. For what could they do against that American colossus whose national income has almost doubled in the war and whose movies are the mainstay of European theaters? Not, says Mr. Molotov, because they're good, but because there's so many and because they are backed by great economic forces. What we should do in Europe, says Mr. Molotov, is not only to eradicate fascism, but to establish democratic regimes and guarantee them against possibility of exploitation by power and wealth. So here we are, right back again to the rival definitions of democracy on which the Big Four split way back in London over a year ago. It's not territorial questions or reparations or even military questions that will hold up the signatures of the Balkan treaties. It's the more fundamental quarrel over the exercise of economic power backed by power politics on both sides that lies at the bottom of the quarrel of West versus East. For that in turn will determine whether Europe is to function as one unit or two. If that fundamental question could be decided between the great powers first, we could begin to see the outlines of the structure of peace, and all the little pieces perfected at Paris might fall into place. So Paris ends with a great big if. It is a very different Paris conference from the conference that ended World War I, and Paris itself
Plays a very different role. No longer the capital of a dominant power, but of a mediator between the powers. But France herself votes with the Western powers, although the Communists are the most powerful party in France.
Today, the French people also voted for the second time on a constitution for the Fourth Republic, and this time, it seems they voted yes by a small but decisive majority, though not all the returns are in. The new draft had been accepted by all three of the leading political parties in the Constituent Assembly, but was again opposed by General de Gaulle. Last time, the popular Republicans had voted against it, and their most powerful mouthpiece was General de Gaulle. This time, General de Gaulle has parted with the popular Republicans, or they with him. Today's vote shows that France is against personal government by him or anyone else. The new Constitution is a compromise between the Communist demand for an all-dominating assembly and the idea of a separation of powers. It does provide for a two-chamber parliament, but with only advisory and delaying powers for the second chamber. It does give some real powers to the president, who presides at cabinet meetings and appoints the premier, subject to the Assembly's will. He, the president, can advise the cabinet and even dissolve Parliament, that is, after 18 months and after 2 ministerial crises. The Constitution does, in short, provide for a somewhat more stable government than the old one, but it is still in the revolutionary tradition of 1789. That democratic tradition, in which individual freedom and the rights of the individual count above everything else, is still the tradition of Western Europe. That ever more patent fact provides the psychological split between East and West at the Paris Conference and in the United Nations. The French have just shown that even communism changes its habits as it moves west. Good night.
The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations, in cooperation with the American Historical Association, have presented Caesar Searchinger. Next week at this time, Mr. Searchinger will be back again with another of his presentations, The Story Behind the Headlines. This program came to you from Radio City, New York. Bill Davies speaking. This is the National Broadcasting Company.